Great. Have to breathe in a bit after that one. That was pretty heavy. Right, so my name's Christopher Neugebauer. I'm going to begin this talk with an obvious statement about open source, but first a content warning or two. I'm going to be discussing two key figures from the history of open source at length, Eric S. Raymond and Linus Law, and I'm going to be talking also about maintainer burnout, so I'm sorry if you wanted some recovery time for that. These are sources of trauma for many in our community. I encourage you to prepare yourself appropriately. If you do feel the need to leave, take a breather. You've got a minute or two before I get to that. Do I need to be louder? You good? Yeah, sure. Okay. So my usual genre is Python comedy talks. A lot of the talks today have been deeply personal. This one is deeply personal for me too, but I'm going to talk like it isn't because I'm insecure like that. I like to speak with false confidence. We'll see how that goes. So, no Python comedy today. I'm here to talk about the historical underpinnings of the stories we tell about open source more generally. And in particular, I'm here to talk about what open source isn't. So you're going to see some cognitive dissonance in these slides. So, the talk. The talk, as I say, begins with an obvious statement about open source, so let's get out of the way. That's that we have a sustainability problem. So, I've served as a director on the board of the Python Software Foundation. That's the capacity in which I know what I'm talking about here. We're the global vendor-neutral home of the Python programming language. We don't write Python itself. We look after the finance and legal governance side of the community. My first term on the PSF started back in June 2018. And in July 2018, this happened. The founder and then benevolent dictator for life of the Python programming language, Guido van Rossum, abruptly resigned his role, saying he never again wanted to fight so hard for an improvement and find that so many people despise his decisions, and that he wanted to remove himself entirely from the decision-making process. And this took place after a long and protracted argument on a mailing list about a two-character syntax feature in the language. This particular situation is one of the few cases where that abrupt resignation ended well. The core development team of Python were able to band together to discuss alternatives for how to structure the decision-making processes of the language, and they came together and built something stronger and which has demonstrated itself to be sustainable through multiple crises. But the subject of maintainer burnout is important. Open source maintainers are stewards of vital digital infrastructure, any piece of which has generally untold and largely undetectable reach into so many aspects of our lives. And it's at this point where I'm practically obliged to share this comic again. Our digital infrastructure is underpinned by some random library maintained by some random person in Nebraska, and it's somewhat of a cliche these days, but it is more true than not, and it's unfortunately more relevant than ever, because this year, for the first time that we know of, maintainer burnout itself was weaponized. The story goes like this. People like to be able to log into their computers remotely. Frequently, remote access is the only way we get to our computers. Thanks, AWS. SSH is a tool that lets people log into those computers remotely. XZ, that is how I'm going to be pronouncing it, I am Australian, it's a compression algorithm. It's provided in the form of a generic library that you can use to compress files or streams of data or anything else that needs compression. It's not part of SSH. Its maintainers do not collaborate with the maintainers of SSH, but SSH can have the XZ library built into the program in order to compress the data being sent back and forth over an SSH session. Now, compression algorithms don't change that much, and the maintenance demands for XZ were sufficiently low that a single maintainer named Lasse Collin was able to successfully maintain the project on his own until June of 2022, when suddenly a number of people appeared on the XZ mailing list and flooded the list with incredibly rude messages, putting pressure on the sole maintainer to cede responsibility to someone else. Jigar Kumar writes, "You ignore the many patches bit rotting away on this mailing list, and right now you choke your repo." Dennis Enns writes, "I am sorry about your mental health limits, but the community desires more. Why not pass on maintainership of XZ? And a week later, something remarkable happened. Someone showed up to help. As I have hinted in earlier emails, Jia Tan may have a bigger role in the future. He has been helping a lot off list and is practically a co-maintainer already, smiley face. Some change in maintainership is already in progress. Now, for people who've seen maintainer burnout before, this was a remarkably fortunate outcome. Over the course of the following 2 years, Jia Tan became a reliable contributor and eventual maintainer of XZ, and in March of this year, he released 2 versions of XZ, all on his own. Now, while doing performance testing on a pre-release version of Debian, Postgres developer Andres Freund noticed strange performance regressions when connecting to SSH servers. And his investigation uncovered that these new releases of XZ contained a backdoor, activated only when XZ was loaded from within the SSH program on certain Linux systems. So-called Jia Tan was a state actor who was able to cleverly embed a backdoor that targeted SSH and SSH only inside a source release of a dependency, XZ, which got picked up by distributors of XZ like Debian. It was exceptionally lucky that the backdoor was found before the compromised version became widespread. A state actor spent literally 2 years building up trust with the maintainer, doing reliable work, such they were able to get the privilege to release their compromised version of XZ. And subsequent investigation showed that the name Jia Tan had only ever appeared in open source in the context of XZ. But something else surprising happened in the subsequent weeks. The name Jigar Kumar, the person who accused Lasse of choking his repo, had never appeared on an open source mailing list before he appeared on the XZ list. Dennis Enns had never appeared out of the context of XZ either. To the best of our ability to tell, all of the actors who created stress and demands on Lasse Collins' time were, if not the same person, certainly associated with the same advanced persistent threat operation. The operation's sock puppets harassed a maintainer under stress, and then another false persona appeared as a savior who saved the maintainer from buckling under the pressure. And it's reasonable to think that we got exceptionally lucky. We did. But there's a bigger question here. How did we let open source get to the point where a deluge of people being rude on a mailing list was so normal that it was recognized as something a maintainer just had to deal with, rather than being recognized as something so extraordinary that it must have been the action of malicious actors? Because in any other course of life, this is not normal behavior and it would not be tolerated. Open source has got to the point where normal behavior is so toxic that literal state actors presenting as toxic people on mailing lists went undetected and could have brought an international security incident upon us. In his 2018 post, Open Source is Not About You, Clojure maintainer Rich Hickey argued that open source is merely a licensing mechanism and not a mode of collaboration. And he uses this frame to justify that it is acceptable for the Clojure team to not directly engage with its users in order to produce its development roadmap. Now, his point is well made. That is how Clojure operates, but this speaks to a disconnect between the developer class and the user class in open source. In the 1998 founding of the Open Source Initiative, Bruce Perrins, who was the project leader at Debian, and his collaborator Eric S. Raymond, better known as ESR, led the creation of the open source definition, which to this day remains the tool that most large corporations and open source related foundations use to determine whether a license is open source or not. Now, OSI remains a vital organization, but they serve quite a small, limited direct audience in that respect. Now, today, open source as it relates to licensing is largely a solved problem, save for some odd rebel efforts over the years. However, the open source definition left the question of collaboration open. Because the focus of open source at the time wasn't just licensing. The name open source was coined in 1998 as a result of the work that Raymond was doing evangelizing a revolutionary new form of collaboration that he claimed to have discovered. In his 1997 essay, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, Raymond, who at the time was a developer best known for writing Emacs extensions, wrote an essay about his experiences developing an email tool called FetchMail. Now, his development process for FetchMail was inspired by his time observing the Linux kernel development process as an outsider, and the essay serves more as a commentary about how Linux worked than any of his own work. And its most famous lesson, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, it posited that the mere existence of publicly available source code was enough to make it trivial to fix bugs. And to make sure you didn't forget it, he gave it a catchy name. And to be clear, this thesis is really compelling. I still hear enough eyes, all bugs shallow, all the damned time, and it's 27 years since that essay was written. And it was compelling back then as well. The essay was used as key evidence by Netscape, who I'm told were really important at the time, to release their web browser. And that act has in the years since been seen as a pivotal moment in the acceptance of open source by business. And this is despite his essay homesteading the new sphere, likening open source to a gift culture, in which works are given away freely by all with no expectation of anything in return. Now, in his understanding, gift cultures are characterized by an abundance of resources, and so works may be given away freely. And so in open source, the abundant resource is code, and therefore open source developers compete for reputation rather than market share. I found this quite confusing and difficult to follow, but it seems to trace back to a discussion in his first essay. In The Cathedral and the Bazaar, he openly mocks the idea of egoless programming, which I'm sure was something that was important back then as well, and he proceeds to describe another community that he considers himself to be a part of, the science fiction fan community. He describes the primary motivation for participation in the sci-fi fan community to be ego boosting, or ego boo for short. Participating in a fan community, going to a convention, allows you to demonstrate the strength of how good a fan you are and become recognized as a great fan by your fellow fans. And the corresponding idea here is that open source contributors contribute to open source in order to gain reputation as great open source contributors, entirely for their own personal self-satisfaction. And he also poo-poos literally any other motivation beyond ego boosting as inherently in service of ego boosting by way of circular reasoning and self-justification. All motivations must be ego boosting because following your motivation satisfies your ego. And it's in this circular self-justification that ESR shows that he didn't look beyond his own personal experience. I have a bunch of friends in the science fiction fan community, and so I actually went and asked them how their community works. And it's true, the vast, vast majority of people there are there merely to participate, gaining self-satisfaction and reputation as a better fan by interacting with fans and potentially authors and potentially other important people there. But there are also people in the science fiction community who participate as convention runners or con runners, who are people who volunteer to make the spaces where the community gathers. And these are people for whom participation begets responsibility as opposed to reputation. And finally, there are people for whom the network of conventions and gatherings provide a livelihood. And these are authors, artists, and dealers, all of whom derive direct economic benefit from the existence of a commons that's being cultivated by con runners. And these three distinct roles form an interdependent network whose differing motivations all reinforce each other. And that's the key. Ego boosters do exist there, and they form the vast majority of that ecosystem, but they only function within a space that's cultivated by the con runners. ESR chose to ignore the part of the community that he wasn't a part of and the motivation that those people have. But just because you choose to ignore something, it doesn't mean it's not there. And so it was with open source. Because even in 1997, Linux did indeed resemble the structure of science fiction. There were ego boosters, there were people cultivating projects, and there were businesses that were making a livelihood from this cultivated commons and contributing their changes back. And the main driver behind those businesses contributing back to Linux was not altruism. There was a requirement towards reciprocity. Linux is an operating system for commodity hardware. And Linux required, and still does require, frequent customizations to support new hardware. And those customizations needed to function atop a base that went through frequent changes. Now, at the time, corporate customizations of other open source systems rarely, if ever, result in source code publication. Multiple proprietary forks were made of BSD Unix, including by corporations who separately contributed to Linux, and several of the popular ones remain proprietary to this day. Being licensed under a copyleft license created a requirement that alterations have source code published. And that's the viral characterization of how the GPL works, if you've ever heard that before. Now, the GPL as originally envisaged only compelled publication of source at the point of distribution. It did not compel contributing code back to the original project, and indeed this was not something that the GPL's authors actively sought. There's a social contract there that technically competent patches would get merged back to mainline Linux, and that social contract was a genuine innovation. It's not unreasonable to argue that a key value of Linux to corporates at the time was that by having their patches accepted back into mainline, they were being absolved of ongoing maintenance costs for their customizations. And this is hardly a want of fixing bugs for fun. Self-satisfaction doesn't pay the bills. Instead, it's a want of externalizing costs, which is a great thing for any profit-driven enterprise to want to achieve. And it's also fair to say, with the benefit of hindsight, that the model of reciprocity that Linux invented was a result of code requiring frequent maintenance on top of an unstable base. In his talk at LinuxConf.au in 2017, Rommel, who I was hoping would be here today but doesn't seem to be, describes a process called lithification, which is the process by which code imported from various sources accumulates layer by layer by layer on top of stable, unchanging bases. Basically, it's easy to vendor in code if you're not going to publish it back upstream. Like, in the absence of a good reason to contribute your changes upstream, most code bases tend to lithify. And one can argue that the forced reciprocity of the GPL created conditions where Linux could resist this. And this affected the BSD community at the time. Like, if you must make changes all the time, why not submit your changes upstream, especially if someone will take care of them for you? So this combination of a legal requirement towards the publication of code, as well as carrot and stick economic incentives motivating contributing to mainline, make significantly more sense to me than the pursuit of self-satisfaction, especially when ESR's argument about self-satisfaction is backed up by whatever the hell this is. People don't do kernel development to help nice guy Linus Torvalds. Linus was the gatekeeper responsible for landing patches on mainline Linux, and his communication style, even in 1997, was widely known to be toxic. Getting a patch into kernel mainline often meant suffering hostile communication, including personal insult. I have friends and I have acquaintances who endured kernel development and left because Linus's communication style was a severe burden on their mental health. ESR recognized Linus as a nice guy. He was not. He never has been. Even Linus knows he's not a nice guy. But by characterizing him as a nice guy whose communication style encourages people to want to help him, ESR explicitly told people coming to open source that they should emulate that communication style as if it is a norm in our community. It should not have been allowed to become so. Fundamentally, you either knew a bit about the context in which this book was written, and you could probably see the unjustifiable or the inaccurate or the downright harmful parts of the book, or you could be a newcomer and decided that the book did a good job explaining the norms of our community and you'd seek to emulate it. And if you're not predisposed to notice the falsehoods, the promise is seductive. If source code is available, users are all potential co-developers. It's compelling and it's as true now as it's always been in open source. However, the book pulls some sleight of hand. It starts describing users of open source as potential co-developers, and then a few chapters later, it describes Linus Torvalds as treating his users as co-developers. And then by the point where he introduces Linus's law, Raymond has fully merged the classes of users and co-developers as one and the same. And further, he asserts that merely characterizing a bug is enough to render it fixed. That is, he makes a jump from the truth that a user can be a co-developer if properly cultivated, to the idea that every user is a co-developer. And to be absolutely clear, this is not me editorializing here. He draws this same equivalence himself. The act of finding a bug is a bigger challenge than understanding it, let alone fixing it. And if you're a corporation staring down the abyss of unviability, but with still millions of users using your primary product, being told that you can immediately convert your user base into unpaid co-developers was probably pretty compelling. And it didn't work out that way for Netscape. It took a number of years to produce a code base that was worthy of being read by the public, let alone a usable piece of software. By 2003, Robert Glass's book, Facts and Fallacies of Software Engineering, cites numerous sources that show that many eyeballs, fewer bugs is demonstrably and repeatably false. And as late as last year, Mozilla was still fixing open bug reports that had remained open for 22 years. It turns out that when you have a veritable shallow sea of bugs, even 1 million eyeballs is not going to help you. But this essay was the basis for selling open source, the collaboration model, to the masses. And the message it carried was that all open source developers are selfish, and that anyone contributing a bug report is doing harder work than the people actually doing the work to keep the project open. And that, combined with venerating the communication style of Linus, absolves the reader who is new to open source from the responsibility of engaging with projects in a meaningful way. And it gives permission for people to model their engagement with open source on someone who prides themselves on deliberately toxic communication patterns. To the best of my research, the essay was seen as a curiosity by people in the community. Actual practitioners continued developing FOSS in the way they always had. And far from transitioning to anarchy, the Apache project adopted formal governance in 1999. Python followed 2 years later. And as for businesses, IBM by 1999 had 200 full-time paid developers working on Linux-based technology, and Red Hat went public later that year, following a trajectory that had been established well before that essay's release. As best as I can tell, ESR's work was pushed primarily by people outside open source who saw themselves as ideologically aligned with ESR. In the 1995 essay, The Californian Ideology, British media theorists Richard Barbrook and Andy Cameron described the ideological environment that emerged in the early internet, primarily arising in and around Silicon Valley. In it, they described an apparently contradictory view that businesses and communication networks had a role in shaping and stabilizing society whilst furthering the reach of unrestricted speech and enabling individual expression. One manifestation of this ideology was in the form of the rise of social media, focusing on broadening the reach of speech with considerably less thought given to moderation of that speech. And in that context, ESR's characterization of speech and as about code, that is, your bug reports, being more important than actual code contributions, as well as inaccurate description of open source developers as primarily selfish, made his vision of open source collaboration in full alignment with this Californian ideology. If only the entrepreneurial class could get involved. So of the many products focused on enabling open source development that emerged in the years following the publication of The Cathedral and the Bazaar, GitHub was certainly the one that most embraced this social media idiom. This is their logo from 2008. We're social but for code. And I want to be clear, I like GitHub a lot, especially these days, but I want to make it clear that pre-Microsoft GitHub was a very different thing. It was a product of its context. GitHub emerged from the Ruby on Rails community and the San Francisco startup scene in 2008. This was a community that emerged independently of the open source community that existed 10 years earlier, from a community that formed from scratch well after the release of Raymond's works. And GitHub succeeded. It succeeded for a number of reasons. They had a built-in market due to Git being chosen by Ruby on Rails. Git being chosen by Ruby on Rails as their version control system, as well as there being extreme difficulty setting up Git self-hosting. And GitHub, unlike competitors, allowed for both private or proprietary development, as well as allowing for public open source repositories. Their contemporaries tended to focus on one or the other. And there's a catch if you're doing open source, which has since been resolved by GitHub's acquisition by Microsoft, that if you wanted to host open source for free on GitHub, your repo needed to be fully public. And being fully public meant that when GitHub added an issue tracker, you had two options for content control. You could either pay for a private repo, or you could have a public repo on which anyone could create or view issues. And GitHub has always given issues, that is, speech about code, equal prominence in the user interface to the code itself. Opting to host your open source code on the most popular hosting platform, which it was by 2010, meant accepting that unrestricted speech by anyone had equal prominence to the code published by the trusted people on the repo, regardless of whether your official bug tracker was hosted on GitHub or not. And to be absolutely clear, when GitHub Issues was released, speech about code was completely unrestricted and not subject to any restriction by repo owners. The first time any reference to editing or deleting or otherwise moderating comments appeared in GitHub's docs in November 2016. And the result of this, combined with ESR's implicit instruction to communicate in the style of a famous asshole when interacting with maintainers, is exactly what you would have expected. The result of GitHub winning amongst its competitors is a platform effect that continues to this day. The vast majority of open source projects communicate in the same way, in public, with the GitHub issue tracker, and are discouraged from seeking alternative methods of communication, even when other organizations will facilitate moderated communication spaces for you. These norms that GitHub gave rise to, which is, if there is an open source project, you must be able to demand the attention of a maintainer, are demanded by a whole class of open source users that have been cultivated in GitHub's early days. And those norms are expected even if the project isn't hosted on GitHub, and even if the maintainers are telling them that their project is not about you. And people have written about the consequences of GitHub's platform effect. In her 2020 book, Working in Public, Nadia Asparahova, then named Nadia Egbal, set out to explain how we could better support the developers of open source projects through improved management of the attention of maintainers, potentially giving them tools to deflect against the dynamics that eventually enabled the XZ attack. And she focuses her writing on stadiums, which are how she names the types of projects that have emerged from the platform effects of GitHub, and in my opinion, the distortions that have arisen from GitHub's early lack of moderation. Now, stadiums are projects where a relatively small number of contributors have to respond to a large number of comments or bug reports on their project in public. And while the book deliberately centers these stadiums, she engages in the same sort of rhetorical sleight of hand that we saw ESR participate in. In early chapters, Working in Public rules out all projects except for those with maintainers from a limited geography, guess it's Western countries, and of those projects, she only engages with ones with a small number of individual maintainers which do not have formal governance and that primarily collaborate on GitHub. And she claims to perform this filtering so as to reduce the scope of the study in the book. And by the time Working in Public reaches chapter 5, where solutions are finally presented, Working in Public starts writing as if the only open source projects that matter are the ones with a small maintainer base and a large user base that organize themselves primarily on GitHub. That is an assertion that all open source looks like the projects that the scope of research had been filtered to. And she suggests that funding individual developers is in better alignment with how all open source is written. She then strongly implies that funding individual developers is best left to individuals, because larger projects are more attractive to corporate funders, effectively making a self-contradictory argument that it's unreasonable to fund projects with many maintainers and formal organization because they're already being funded, which we know they're not. And on the way to getting there, she rules out entirely without justification that governments are inappropriate as funding bodies for open source. An analysis of subsequent reality shows that less than 2 years later, the German government would establish a sovereign tech fund. And in its first year, they allocated more than 13 million euros towards strategically important projects, including at least one stadium-style project without the backing of a larger organization. And the recipients of those grants certainly did not protest that. And finally, as the work suggests, as if there are no alternative options, there are very few people who like the idea of running the sort of formal legal entity that would make their project more attractive to funders. That's fair. I'm on the board of one of them. It's tough work. The results of that work are incremental and unfulfilling and thankless, and starting one is even harder. But there is an alternative to starting your own legal entity. You can organize with other projects. The Apache Software Foundation provides administrative services, including collecting money, on behalf of hundreds of projects that would otherwise be small and maintained by sole maintainers. And they've done that for 25 years. The Pallets project is a small group of maintainers, but their lead maintainer reached out to the Python Software Foundation several years ago, and now their administrative overhead is covered by the PSF. Private organizations like Tidelift sell support services to corporations on behalf of smaller open source projects. Like, just because a project doesn't have the capability to seek resources as it's currently constituted, it doesn't mean that it's not possible to reorganize yourself just to make yourself more desirable to funders. So working in public absolves corporations from responsibility for supporting the open source maintainers that they depend upon, and allows developers to enjoy learned helplessness about their ability to receive support in handling the demands on their time, when in fact the solutions are right there in front of them if they want to go looking for it. Now, working in public has what I describe as a mild reception amongst open source practitioners, but I'm reliably informed that it's gaining popularity amongst content creators, who, thanks to the work's narrow focus on projects with a platform with a large audience, see open source maintainers as enduring the same struggle as them. And they're now communicating a distorted view of how open source works to their audience, another generation of potential contributors. And the author has, since publishing Working in Public, moved on from studying open source. And so our community is polluted with false narratives about how open source works by people with no real stake in the projects they describe, and with false claims about how to fix it. So what do we do about it? First, we need to understand that works like the Cathedral and the Bazaar or Working in Public are not for practitioners. They explain how newcomers can participate in open source. Stories about the value of getting involved in open source are not of value to people who are already in open source. But ignoring them as irrelevant rather than highlighting the harm that they cause gives rise to opportunities for others to boost them as valuable. And that opportunity exists because there is an unfulfilled need. Open source is a valuable field, and for people outside our field, they deserve to know our past, our current struggles, and more importantly, they need to know how it works so they can participate properly. And for as long as there's an opportunity for these stories to be told, they will be told. And we could choose to tell our own stories, or instead the story will be told by outsiders who do not have to bear the consequences of their work. And those outsiders who seem to get popular, they describe falsely a world of open source where people on the fringes either have no consequences for their participation, or worse still, are told that they make contributions that are outsized and more valuable than the people living with the actual consequences of those interactions. People with this distorted view of how open source works create tools that impose that distorted worldview on people who develop open source. And in turn, the communities that form on those platforms are shaped by those tools in turn. Now, just because our communities are shaped by the tools that we use, it does not mean that we have to accept those tools. Other tools are available to us, and you can pick and choose the best features from all of them. You can have a fiscal sponsor look after your legal overheads, and you can still have your code hosted on GitHub. And that's the thing. By not being realistic about the consequences of actions or the options that are available, we're lying to people when we describe open source. That you can contribute to an open source project without consequences on the maintainers, that merely reporting a bug is more difficult than maintaining a project, and that people who reap actual economic benefit from a project are somehow free of responsibility to care for it. And there are books out there that are written by people who actually spend their time in open source, and get tech review from people who are actually in open source, and will equip you to be an effective contributor to an active open source project. This one, Forge Your Future, by my friend VM Brasseur, is excellent. Buy a copy, buy several copies, recommend it to your friends. but it's also real about the responsibilities that come with contributing to open source. And that's what makes it a good book. It is far, far easier to recommend books that free the readers from the responsibility to each other. But that's not how successful open source works, and we shouldn't be selling newcomers on that utopian dream. Because the result of newcomers being sold this dream of literal speech as more important as code and governance and the janitorial work that keeps open source alive is that maintainers of projects, big and small, come to think that unchecked bad behavior is normal, and then rightly make the decision that open source is not for them, and then they leave and they hand over responsibility. We got exceptionally lucky this year. The attackers who focused on the social fabric of our community will have learnt from their failure, and they'd be so lucky if we didn't learn from ours. As for what we could start telling newcomers, well, imagine if instead of the next generation of people who shape open source learning, that making bug reports was the important work, that enough eyeballs make bugs shallow, that they actually learnt to contribute in a way that sustained the projects they were interacting with. Given enough hands, all work is light. Thank you. My name's Christopher Neugebauer. I've been reading ESR for the last month, and the bar's closed, damn it. Thank you.